The morning began with cold, almost suffocating silence. Alex sat at the kitchen table, his attention entirely absorbed by his phone. We no longer talked unless it was necessary, and every word, when spoken, felt sharp and searing. I made coffee, mechanically pouring it into a cup, and sat across from him. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if another argument was just waiting to erupt. I was exhausted from this constant state of vigilance. It had been haunting us for months, turning every little thing into a source of dissatisfaction. Alex was someone who couldn't tolerate uncertainty, while my life in recent years seemed to consist of nothing but unanswered questions. His distrust, the way he looked at me with more suspicion than love, had become part of our daily reality. As I finished my coffee, the weight in my chest became unbearable. I could no longer ignore the fact that our marriage was falling apart. The realization hit me suddenly but with startling clarity. I didn't explain anything. I simply went upstairs, packed a small bag with essentials, and returned to the kitchen, where Alex sat as if he hadn't even noticed my absence. Walking out of the house, I felt a small weight lift from my shoulders. If only temporarily I had escaped all of it. The drive to my sister Elizabeth's house felt strangely long, though the distance wasn't far. We had always been close, but in recent years we rarely saw each other. I knew her home would be a refuge for me, a place where I could regain my strength and perhaps sort through my thoughts. Elizabeth greeted me warmly, as always. She never asked unnecessary questions, but I could see the concern in her eyes. I didn't need to say much. She understood everything just by looking at me. Her house was always filled with comfort, her care evident in every detail. I tried to distract myself by helping with chores, cleaning, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Alex. I couldn't pinpoint when exactly our relationship began to crumble, and I wondered if it had been inevitable all along. One evening, Elizabeth casually mentioned that her son, my nephew Evan, would be coming home for the holidays in a few days. I vaguely remembered how he had been the last time I saw him, but those memories didn't align with the image of the grown man he must have become. For some reason, the news stirred a strange sense of anticipation in me. The first days at Elizabeth's house were peaceful, almost monotonous. I wanted a break from the chaos and tension that had followed me from home. Elizabeth, as always, was attentive and unintrusive. She seemed to understand that I needed time to collect myself. I tried to stay busy, helping her around the house, cooking meals, washing windows, tidying up. My hands were occupied, but my thoughts wandered far away. At times, I found myself subconsciously searching for answers to questions I couldn't even articulate. Elizabeth spoke to me gently, avoiding the subject of my marriage. Her words were casual, yet they carried an unspoken support. We talked about mundane things, which groceries to buy, what flowers to plant in the garden come spring. This simplicity brought a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in a long time. One evening, as I was putting away dishes after dinner, my sister casually mentioned that there wasn't enough space in the house for guests. "Would you mind sharing a room with Evan when he gets here?" she asked, her gaze focused on the sink. I froze for a moment, caught off guard. Evan and I had always gotten along, but I still thought of him as a teenager, awkward and shy. Now he was an adult, and the idea of sharing a bed with him felt unexpected. "Of course not," I replied, keeping my tone neutral, though the thought unsettled me. That night, lying in bed, I found myself thinking about the last time I had seen Evan. His hair had been messy, his face still round with traces of childhood, and his gaze innocent and kind. We had always spent time together, laughing, playing board games, going on walks, but years had passed. According to Elizabeth, he had changed, become more serious, more grown up, with a confidence he hadn't possessed before. I tried to picture him like that, but all I could see was the boy I used to stroll through the park with. The next day I threw myself into chores, but the strange feeling lingered. My sister's comment about the lack of space stuck in my mind, forcing me to consider the situation. Questions began to take shape. What would Evan look like now? How had our nephew changed over the years? And most importantly, how would our relationship shift when I had to share such close quarters with him? The night was dark and still. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rustling wind outside. The house was completely silent, as if the world had paused. Exhaustion from the day washed over me in waves, yet sleep remained elusive. It was well past midnight when I heard the front door slam. The sharp sound broke the calm, making me freeze. Moments later, steady, confident footsteps echoed through the hall, followed by the low murmur of Elizabeth's voice, likely greeting Evan. I lay motionless, trying not to make a sound, though curiosity tugged at me. As I propped myself up slightly, the door to my room creaked open, and a tall silhouette appeared in the darkness. "Sarah?" His voice was low, slightly husky, but carried an unexpected confidence. I reached for the bedside lamp, and the soft light illuminated his face. This wasn't the boy I remembered. Standing before me was a grown man with sharp features, a faint trace of fatigue, and piercing eyes. I tried to smile, masking my surprise. "Evan, you're early." "Had to. Needed a break from everything," he said, casually dropping his bag to the floor. His calm demeanor and self-assured presence unsettled me slightly. We exchanged a few words before I suggested he get some rest. He nodded, undressing in the room with an ease that showed he was completely at ease with himself and my presence. As he settled into bed beside me, the space suddenly felt too small. I turned toward the wall, avoiding looking at him, but his proximity was impossible to ignore. The faint scent of expensive cologne lingered in the air, both familiar and entirely new, making it hard to relax. Even in the silence, I could feel his gaze on me now and then. It made my nerves tingle, though I wasn't sure why. I forced myself to stay still, pretending to sleep, but my thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. How much he had changed, not just in appearance, but in the way he carried himself. Evan was no longer the shy teenager I remembered. He was confident, calm, and fully aware of his presence in the room. The night passed without incident. In the morning when I woke, he was already gone. His side of the bed was neatly made, and the faint trace of his cologne still lingered in the air. But the memory of his gaze and his confidence stayed with me. The next morning, the house was buzzing with activity. Elizabeth hummed softly to herself as she sorted through boxes of documents, while Evan moved around the kitchen helping with breakfast. I came downstairs, trying to mask the slight unease lingering from the previous night. Evan greeted me with a calm smile, as if sharing a bed had been the most ordinary thing in the world for him. His ease surprised me and unsettled me at the same time. "Good morning, Sarah," he said, handing me a cup of coffee. I nodded, focusing on the day ahead. It turned out to be a busy one. Together with Elizabeth and Evan, we cleaned the garden, sorted through old belongings, and even managed a trip to the store. Elizabeth seized every opportunity to talk about home repairs and her plans for the summer. Amidst this mundane flurry of activity, I momentarily forgot my anxieties, but Evan wouldn't let me forget entirely. His presence was felt in every small gesture. He would brush my hand while passing me a knife to peel vegetables or make an innocent joke that brought an involuntary smile to my face. His humor was lighthearted, but it threw me off balance. While we were preparing dinner, he helped me chop vegetables. At one point, his hand accidentally grazed mine, and I felt a shiver run through me. I glanced at him, but his expression was entirely neutral, as if nothing had happened. "You take this so seriously," he remarked, watching me carefully arrange the chopped pieces. "I just like everything in its place," I replied, keeping my tone even. His eyes lingered on me for a moment too long, and I quickly turned my attention to the stove, unwilling to let the moment grow into something more. By evening, I was exhausted, but not just from the day's work. Inside, a strange conflict was beginning to take shape. On one hand, Evan was still my nephew, someone I had always shared a warm familial bond with. On the other, his behavior, his touches, his glances, stirred thoughts in me that I couldn't allow myself to entertain. I convinced myself it was just fatigue and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that ignoring these feelings was becoming increasingly difficult. The house had fallen into its nightly silence. Elizabeth had long since gone to bed, and I was trying to settle into the mattress, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. The day had been busy, yet instead of exhaustion, I felt a strange tension. From the adjacent room, Evan's footsteps quieted, and it seemed he too was preparing for sleep. When the door creaked open, I had already closed my eyes, feigning sleep. Soft footsteps, the rustle of fabric. Evan slipped carefully into bed. The mattress dipped slightly beneath his weight, but otherwise all was still. I didn't expect him to speak. "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" His voice was low, yet in the dark it seemed piercingly clear. I turned slightly toward him, not immediately understanding what he meant. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Your life, Sarah. Whether you're happy." His question caught me off guard. He asked it so simply, as though he genuinely wanted to know and not to judge. "Everyone wonders about that sometimes," I replied evasively, not wanting to dig any deeper. But he didn't back down. "You don't seem happy." His words made me freeze. I wanted to turn away, to end the conversation, but something kept me rooted. I could feel his gaze on me even in the dark. "That's none of your business, Evan," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. But he didn't seem offended. A faint trace of a smile was audible in his voice. "Maybe not, but I care." The pause that followed was almost tangible. I felt him draw closer. His breathing was deeper, warmer. It was a moment that could have been broken with a single movement, a turn, a step, anything. But I didn't move. His lips touched mine, soft, tentative, as if testing whether I would let my heart stop him. Warmth spread through me, but within seconds I pulled away sharply, as though jolted back to reality. "No, Evan, this is wrong," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He looked at me but said nothing. I turned away, facing the wall, trying to steady the tremble in my hands. Inside, everything was at war. Guilt, embarrassment, fear. Morning brought awkwardness. We both avoided looking at each other. Breakfast passed in strained silence, with Elizabeth thankfully oblivious to the tension. But every glance, every gesture felt heavier than it should have. The following days, I tried to fill every minute with tasks. Waking up early, I immediately headed to the garden or began cleaning. I left no time to dwell on what had happened that night with Evan. Elizabeth was more than happy with my burst of activity. Together, we painted the fence, moved boxes of tools, and sorted old belongings in the attic. In those moments, I felt almost normal, as if nothing had happened. But the moment Evan was nearby, everything changed. He acted as if the kiss had never happened. Yet his presence was impossible to ignore. He always found an excuse to linger, handing me a cup of tea, passing me a paintbrush, or cracking a joke to make me smile. His calm demeanor, the softness in his movements, and his attentiveness stirred in me a mix of gratitude and irritation. I caught myself avoiding his gaze. Every time our eyes met, I felt as though he saw too much, as if he understood what was happening inside me better than I did. Inside, a conflict raged. On one hand, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt toward Alex. Despite his coldness, he was my husband, the man I had shared my life with for years. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore how Evan awakened desires in me that I had long tried to suppress. A conversation with Alex that evening only strengthened my resolve to stay away from Evan. "Why are you staying at your sister's for so long?" His voice was dry, devoid of the usual care. "I need time. We both know that," I replied, trying to remain calm. The silence on his end stretched for what felt like an eternity. "You need to figure out what you want, Sarah," he finally said. "But remember, I have my limits too." Those words felt like a trap. Instead of feeling supported, I was reminded of the growing wall between us. The call ended quickly, leaving me in complete disarray. I threw myself back into work, desperate not to think about it. But Evan, without actively interfering in my tasks, remained present. His support was subtle yet undeniable. The silence between us became almost unbearable. I avoided talking to him about anything serious, but I could sense he was waiting. He wasn't rushing me, as if he knew I would have to make a decision sooner or later. The day was winding down, and I, exhausted from endless tasks, was ready to rest. The house had settled into its usual evening quiet. Elizabeth was reading in her room, and Evan sat on the porch, slowly sipping tea. I was about to walk past him when he called out to me. "Sarah, how about going out tonight? Maybe a walk or a late-night movie?" His question caught me off guard. I glanced around to make sure Elizabeth couldn't hear us. "A movie? Now?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. "Why not? There's nothing to do here, and you look like you could use a break." I wanted to decline, but his tone, confident and slightly teasing, made me pause. Maybe he was right. A walk or a movie might help me clear my head. It was just an innocent evening, after all. I agreed. We chose a small theater in a nearby town. The movie, whose title I didn't even remember, turned out to be dull, but it didn't matter. Evan's attention was entirely on me. He joked, asked questions, and listened intently. His focus was so obvious I couldn't ignore it. On the way home, we walked along a quiet street. The moonlight lit our path, and the world around us was silent. Evan walked close, his shoulder almost brushing mine. "Did you regret coming?" he asked. "No," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure how I felt. He slowed his pace slightly, and I felt the tension between us become palpable. It was more than simple conversation. Something in his gaze, in his voice, stirred both unease and an undeniable pull within me. By the time we got home, it was past midnight. Elizabeth was already asleep, and the house greeted us with silence. I tried to act natural, but as I climbed into bed, my heart was racing. Evan lay down beside me, and once again the bed felt too small. An awkward silence enveloped us. I turned toward the wall, avoiding looking in his direction. But the thoughts of what had transpired that evening refused to leave me. His attentiveness, his confidence, even his quietness. All of it deepened the turmoil within me. I told myself it was just a random evening, but inside everything was churning. The morning began with the usual noise. Elizabeth was in the kitchen preparing breakfast, discussing upcoming plans with someone over the phone. I tried to distract myself by helping her chop vegetables, but every moment felt heavier than usual. Evan appeared later. He walked into the kitchen with the calm confidence that seemed to have become his natural demeanor. My heart tightened as he smiled nonchalantly and sat down at the table. "Sarah, can we talk?" His voice was soft, but there was a firmness to it that left no room for avoidance. I froze, catching a glimpse of Elizabeth leaving the kitchen, leaving us alone. "Talk about what?" I asked, setting down the knife and wiping my hands on a towel, trying to maintain composure. He paused as if carefully choosing his words, then said plainly, "About what happened between us." Everything inside me froze. I had expected him to avoid the topic just as I had been doing, but his confidence only magnified my own uncertainty. "Evan, I thought we agreed to forget about it," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I can't, and I don't want to." His words were so simple, as if he were discussing ordinary things and not the forbidden kiss that had been haunting me. I met his gaze, but he stared back calmly, as though waiting for my response. "You need to understand that it was a mistake," I said, feeling the tension inside me growing. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "It wasn't a mistake. I felt this way for a long time, and I don't want to pretend it doesn't exist anymore." The words hit like a blow. His eyes held the same confidence that terrified me. This wasn't the boy I once knew. This was a man who had decided what he wanted. I tried to get up, to leave the room, but his gaze caught mine, stopping me without a word. The air felt thicker, as though I no longer had control over anything around me. "Evan, I can't," I started, but left the sentence unfinished. He didn't respond. His silence was heavier than any words, and his gaze seemed to say that he was willing to wait as long as it took. I felt like I was losing control of the situation. Everything I had been trying so hard to ignore was surfacing, bringing guilt, fear, and an inexplicable pull all at once. By the time Elizabeth returned to the kitchen, I had managed to regain some composure, but I spent the rest of the day avoiding everyone, keeping to the shadows. Evan didn't press further, but I knew this conversation was just the beginning. The night was dark and quiet, with only the soft glow of moonlight slipping through the curtains. I lay in bed with my eyes closed, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts wouldn't settle, and the air in the room felt charged. Different Evan came in later than usual. The door creaked softly, and I could hear his careful steps as he entered. My heartbeat quickened, but I stayed still, pretending to be asleep. He settled on his side of the bed, but his presence felt overwhelming. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sound of our breathing. I knew he wasn't asleep, and he knew I wasn't either. "Sarah," he said softly. I didn't respond immediately, but the words came out before I could stop them. "What? Do you think we can just ignore this? Or—" His voice was calm, yet it carried a gentleness that made me feel exposed. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted him to stop. But even more, I feared he actually would. I turned to face him. The moonlight highlighted his face, serious, calm, but with a spark in his eyes that unsettled me. "Evan, we can't. This is wrong," I said, but my voice betrayed me, trembling slightly. "But you want this," he whispered, his words a challenge. My breathing quickened. I felt the heat building inside me. This was the moment to break it off, to leave the room, to end this, but instead, I stayed. He moved closer, slowly, giving me the chance to stop him. His hand brushed against mine, trailing softly along my wrist as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. His touch was confident but unhurried. When his lips met mine, the tension of the past days seemed to melt away. There was warmth in his kiss, a tenderness I hadn't felt in so long. He pulled me closer, and I didn't resist. In that moment, it felt like the only right thing to do. His hands, strong and sure, traced along my back, making me forget everything but the two of us. My body responded before my mind could catch up. I felt his breath against my skin, his heartbeat racing in time with mine. His touches grew more insistent, but the gentleness remained, disarming me completely. When his lips moved along my neck, I couldn't suppress the soft sigh that escaped me. In that instant, all barriers crumbled. I knew this was wrong, but stopping was impossible. The guilt, the consequences, the knowledge of how this would change everything, they lingered in the background. But I pushed them aside, closing my eyes to what couldn't be undone. That night was the culmination of everything that had been building between us. In his arms, I felt wanted, alive, as though I had woken from a long sleep. When it was over, silence returned. I lay there, my heart still racing. Evan didn't say a word, but his hand lightly trailed down my arm before he moved back to his side of the bed. I turned toward the wall, feeling both relief and overwhelming guilt. The conflict within me was tearing me apart. I had crossed a line I never should have. The next morning, I got up earlier than usual. Evan was still asleep, his face peaceful and relaxed. I tried to act as though nothing had happened, but the tension only grew. Elizabeth, blissfully unaware, drew me into the usual routine, but I could barely focus. Every time I saw Evan, my heart clenched. He seemed calm, as if the night hadn't happened. But I knew it had. And I knew the consequences were still to come. The morning began with an unsettling call. My phone buzzed, and still lost in thoughts of the previous night, I grabbed it without checking the screen. Alex's voice froze me in place. "Sarah," he started dryly, "you haven't called in a while. Is everything okay?" I felt a tight knot form inside me. His words sounded casual, but there was something probing beneath the surface. "Yes, everything's fine," I replied, forcing a casual tone. "Are you sure?" His voice sharpened. "You sound off." I knew he sensed it. My guilt, buried beneath the surface, was bleeding through even in my voice. "Just tired," I tried to explain, but the pause on the other end told me he didn't believe me. "I'm coming this weekend," he announced. "We need to talk." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. I didn't even have a chance to protest before he said goodbye and hung up. The entire day, I couldn't shake the anxiety. Every word of that conversation echoed in my mind. Alex had sensed something was wrong. His intuition was always sharp, and I knew his visit would bring more questions than answers. Elizabeth, observing me, started noticing the changes. She tried to engage me in conversation, but I deflected, claiming fatigue or discomfort. "Sarah, you're not yourself," she said one evening at dinner. "Is everything okay?" Her words were gentle, but her gaze was piercing. I knew she wouldn't believe my excuses, but I didn't have the strength to open up. Meanwhile, Evan became bolder. He no longer tried to hide his feelings, though he wasn't forceful. His words were few but precise, his glances lingering longer than they should. One evening, while we were alone in the garden, he approached me, quietly but with confidence. "I know what you're feeling," he said, meeting my eyes. "Evan, please don't," I whispered, feeling the ground shift beneath me. "I can't ignore it, and neither can you." I turned away, trying to summon the strength to tell him this was all a mistake. But his words, his certainty, made it all the harder. The night brought no solace. I lay in bed, acutely aware of his presence beside me, yet avoiding looking in his direction. We didn't speak, but the tension between us only grew. And with Alex's visit looming, I knew navigating this situation would become even more impossible. The morning began with a heavy feeling, as if all my attempts to keep control over the situation were crumbling. I could no longer pretend to myself that everything was fine. Elizabeth was too perceptive not to notice the change in me. She was sitting at the breakfast table when I walked into the kitchen, her gaze immediately fixed on me, and I knew there was no escaping the conversation. "Sarah," she started calmly but with a firmness in her tone. "What's going on with you?" I froze, holding my cup of tea. "Nothing, I'm just tired." I tried to brush it off, but her eyes held too much understanding. "You've been saying that for days. You're not yourself. I know you, Sarah, and I know when you're hiding something." Her words were gentle, but they carried an undeniable weight. I sat across from her, feeling a knot of tension tightening inside me. "Elizabeth, everything's fine. It's just—" I began. But my voice wavered. She didn't push me, just waited, silently encouraging me to continue. "Is it about Alex? Did you two have a fight?" she asked cautiously. I nodded, hoping to deflect her suspicions, but my thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. I felt the words rising inside me, demanding to be spoken. "There's been something wrong between us for a long time," I finally said. It was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Her eyes studied my face carefully. "Is it just him? Or is there something else?" My heart clenched. It was as if she could see right through me. I was on the verge of confessing, but fear held me back. "It's complicated," I managed to say, lowering my gaze. Elizabeth sighed but didn't press further. "You know, Sarah, you can tell me anything. I just want you to be happy." Her words hit me harder than I expected. As she got up to clear the table, I felt a lump rise in my throat. I couldn't tell her. I couldn't explain that things had gone too far. The day passed in a blur of tension. Elizabeth and I busied ourselves with cleaning, preparing for Alex's arrival. Every new text or call made my heart skip a beat. Evan avoided lengthy conversations, but his presence was impossible to ignore. When our eyes met, I saw in his gaze something that only heightened my anxiety. He knew what I felt and had no intention of stepping back. By evening, the tension was almost unbearable. My role as a wife, a sister, and someone who was supposed to keep everything together was unraveling before my eyes. I knew I couldn't hide my feelings for much longer. The gray sky that morning mirrored my inner turmoil. Each passing hour brought Alex's arrival closer, and the tension in the air thickened. Elizabeth moved about the house, quietly helping with preparations. Her silent understanding felt like both comfort and a reminder of everything I was trying to conceal. The sound of a car pulling up outside felt like an alarm bell. I greeted Alex at the door. He looked tired but composed, his gaze sharp, as if he was already piecing things together. We exchanged brief greetings. His tone was calm, but a current of unease ran beneath it. When I stepped forward to hug him, my movements felt stiff, rehearsed, and his response was equally restrained. Evan entered the living room not long after Alex came inside. His presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. He greeted Alex with a polite handshake and a neutral expression, but the tension between them was palpable. Alex's eyes lingered on Evan a moment too long, his expression unreadable. During lunch, the unspoken tension thickened. Alex's gaze flicked between Evan and me as if searching for some hidden connection. Evan, meanwhile, was unnervingly calm, his composure only adding to the pressure. The meal tasted like nothing. I spoke about small, mundane things to fill the silence, but the weight of Alex's scrutiny pressed heavily on me. Afterward, as I cleared the dishes, Alex lingered in the room. His presence was oppressive, his silence more powerful than any confrontation. I could feel his eyes on me as I worked, though I didn't dare meet his gaze. Later in the bedroom, I could hear Alex pacing softly. Each movement felt like an unspoken question, one I wasn't ready to answer. Evan kept his distance, but his presence was inescapable. Every glance he had thrown my way throughout the day was a reminder of the night we shared. I struggled to maintain a facade of normalcy, but inside everything was unraveling. Alex was too observant, too perceptive. I knew his suspicions were growing, and it was only a matter of time before he confronted me directly. The night was silent, but sleep eluded me again. Thoughts of the past days, of Alex and Evan, swirled in my mind, keeping me restless. I lay in bed listening to the stillness of the house when Evan stepped into the room. "Can't sleep?" His voice was low, barely audible, careful not to wake anyone else. I didn't answer immediately. Too many emotions churned inside me: fear, guilt, and the growing realization that this couldn't continue. "You shouldn't be here, Evan," I whispered, turning toward the wall. He sat on the edge of the bed, his presence so close it made my pulse quicken. "I can't just leave, Sarah. We both know that." His words were quiet, but filled with a certainty that made it impossible to dismiss him. I could feel his gaze, his warm breath, and it only deepened the chaos in my mind. We spoke softly, almost in whispers, but the conversation was dangerously intimate. It wasn't just words, it was too personal, too revealing. Then the door burst open. I heard Alex freeze in the doorway, his silence louder than any words. "What's going on here?" His voice was flat, but there was a dangerous edge to it. I sat up quickly, feeling the blood drain from my face. Evan rose slowly but didn't step back. His calm demeanor only added fuel to the fire. "Alex, this isn't what it looks like," I began, but my voice trembled. "Not what it looks like?" he exploded, stepping into the room. "You're sitting here talking to him in bed at night and it means nothing?" The commotion brought Elizabeth running. She froze in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting between the three of us. Alex turned to her, his voice dripping with bitterness. "Your sister, it seems, has found comfort in your son." Her eyes widened as she looked between me and Evan, searching for answers, for truth. "This isn't what you think," I tried again, but my words were drowned out by Alex's fury. "I tried so hard to hold this marriage together." His voice cracked and he looked more broken than angry. "And you let this happen?" Evan, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "This is my fault," he said calmly. "Don't blame Sarah." His words only enraged Alex further. You're just a boy who doesn't know his place." Elizabeth stepped forward, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. "Enough. This won't solve anything," she said firmly, though her tone held a hint of uncertainty. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. The situation had spiraled out of control. My heart was heavy with guilt, but I couldn't find the words to explain or make it right. I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by scattered belongings and empty bags. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the items, while thoughts crashed through my mind like an unstoppable storm. It was over. I had destroyed what once seemed unbreakable. Alex didn't even stay to listen. His face was tight, his lips pressed together, his gaze cold and unforgiving. He spoke just a few words, but they were enough to shatter me completely. "It's over. You did this yourself." And then he was gone. He didn't turn back, didn't give me even the faintest chance to explain. The door slammed behind him, leaving me in deafening silence. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, her expression torn between confusion and sorrow. She looked lost, trapped between her emotions and the need to hold her family together. "Sarah, I don't know what to say," she whispered. I nodded, gathering what little resolve I had left. "You don't have to say anything. It's all clear." She stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder, but the gesture brought no comfort. Her son remained in the other room, silent and withdrawn. I knew I had to leave. Staying would only hurt everyone more. As the sun began to set, I carried my belongings to the car. The yard was bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights and the air smelled of damp earth. Elizabeth watched me from the window but didn't come outside to say goodbye. Sitting behind the wheel, I allowed myself one last look at the house. It was supposed to be a refuge, a place where I could find peace. Instead, it had become the site of my greatest loss. The road stretched into the night. The headlights illuminated trees and road signs, but their light felt faint, like my futile attempt to grasp what came next. I had destroyed my marriage, betrayed the trust of my family, and lost my own sense of self. Yet there was a strange thought I couldn't shake. Maybe this was meant to happen. I didn't know where I was going or what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: the way back was gone.